Hi, Tony DeWitt here, Missouri appellate attorney and a guy who likes to make the law make sense on YouTube. Today, because we've had a viewer request, we are going to discuss personal jurisdiction. I'll have more on that in just a moment down here at the beach. Personal jurisdiction, hard to understand and easy to screw up. I'm going to go through this and I'm going to talk about all of these concepts, but I want to make the point up front. This is not a subject for amateur hour, okay? If you have a jurisdictional issue, it's something that needs to be handled by an attorney who knows a thing or two about jurisdiction and how to argue it, because it's really easy to make a mistake that will wind up having significant effects on you if you don't get this problem taken care of as quickly as possible. First of all, let's talk about what jurisdiction is. Jurisdiction is the power of the court to issue a judgment that will bind a defendant. Now, the plaintiff doesn't have an issue with jurisdiction because they've come into court and they've sued someone. They have basically consented to the jurisdiction of the court, and the court has personal jurisdiction over the plaintiff. The issue is always only one of whether the court has personal jurisdiction over the defendant. Now, there are three types of jurisdiction. There is subject matter jurisdiction, personal jurisdiction, and in rem jurisdiction. We'll talk about all of these. Subject matter jurisdiction basically relates to the cause of action that's being brought. If it's a tort claim, for example, you're suing somebody for fraud, as an example, that's going to be in the state court in the county where you reside. And generally speaking, the defendant can be anyone, anywhere, if they have purposefully availed themselves to doing business in the state where you live. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. But in addition to being proper in the state court, if the amount of suit is greater than $75,000, and if the defendant lives somewhere else, a different state, then you also will have jurisdiction through diversity jurisdiction in federal court, although that is rarely a favorable forum for a plaintiff. The next issue about subject matter jurisdiction is that you cannot waive it. In other words, if a court does not have subject matter jurisdiction, they do not have the power to render a decision that binds the defendant. So, for example, a cause of action like the Federal False Claims Act, there is only jurisdiction in the federal courts for that act. And if you sued in state court, even if you got a judgment, you couldn't enforce it. And another interesting thing about subject matter jurisdiction, not only can it not be waived, it can be raised at any time. There is a Supreme Court case where jurisdiction was perhaps not appropriate, and nobody raised it at the trial court. Nobody raised it at the Court of Appeals. And when the Supreme Court got the case, they said, hey, we're dismissing the appeal and directing that the court vacate its judgment because the court didn't have jurisdiction. So it can be raised at any time. And that makes subject matter jurisdiction something that most attorneys understand very, very well and try very hard to make sure they have good subject matter jurisdiction before they go into court. The second level of jurisdiction is called personal jurisdiction. And while subject matter jurisdiction deals with the subject matter of the lawsuit, personal jurisdiction deals with the ability to bind a particular defendant to the judgment. And in order to do that, there are certain standards that have to be met. And then the third issue, in rem jurisdiction, deals with jurisdiction over a raise, a piece of property. For example, a probate estate is in rem jurisdiction. And if you are an heir and you live in a distant state, well, the court doesn't have to have personal jurisdiction over you. It has jurisdiction over the probate estate, and if you don't show up and try and claim your share, then the court is not responsible if you don't get what you're supposed to get. So those three types of jurisdiction matter. Now the next question is personal jurisdiction. How do you go about getting it when someone doesn't live in the same county with you? or the same state. Because if they live in the same state, you just use a sheriff within the state to serve them the process and bring them into court. But let's say that you have a plaintiff in Missouri and a defendant who lives in perhaps Ohio. What do you do then? Well, then you have to use the state's long-arm statute. The long-arm statute is built on the concept that the statutes in a particular state determine the jurisdiction of that state's courts within limits. And what are those limits? Those are the limits of due process. For example, in order to have a suitable case, a suitable assertion of personal jurisdiction, the person has to have some connection to the forum. The issue has to arise out of that connection to the forum, and there have to be sufficient contacts to make it fair to defend the lawsuit in that forum. So, because the person who asked me is located in Washington State, I'm going to take a look at the Washington State long-arm statute next. This is Washington State's long-arm statute, and it says any person, whether or not a citizen or resident of the state, who in person or through an agent does any of the acts in this section enumerated, thereby submits said person, and if an individual, his or her personal representative, to the jurisdiction of the courts of this state as to any cause of action arising from the doing of any said acts. A, the transaction of any business within this state. B, the commission of a tortious act within this state. Now, when it talks about the transaction of business, basically what it means is selling something into that state such that you should reasonably expect to be sued for it if something goes wrong with it. For example, if you sell cars into the state of Washington and one of them blows up and hurts somebody, there's a good chance you're going to get sued, and that's fair because you knowingly transacted business there. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's always going to happen. If you transact business there, the claim has to arise out of something you've done to transact business. So, for example, a manufacturer who makes piano wire, let's say, and sells it to a number of different music stores in Washington State, if his truck that he uses to deliver piano wire is traveling through Northern California and runs over someone, he's from California and the plaintiff is from California, the plaintiff can't go up to Seattle and sue him because he does business in Washington State, because the claim doesn't arise out of him doing business in Washington State. And of course, that makes eminent sense. When the statute discusses committing a tortious act in the state, that doesn't mean you have to be physically present in the state. It means that the act has to be recognized in the state. And basically, for example, let's suppose that you answer an ad in a magazine for a engraved copper sculpture of Abraham Lincoln, and it's only $29.95, and you send in your $29.95 and they send you back one of these. You've probably been defrauded. Well, the fraud occurred in Washington State, and the tortious act occurred in Washington State because that's where the advertisement was seen. So that would be, you'd have jurisdiction under both A and B in that situation. Let's go on with the rest of the statute here. The ownership, use, or possession of any property, whether real or personal, situated in this state, that will get you jurisdiction. Contracting to insure any person, property, or risk located within this state at the time of contracting. The act of sexual intercourse within this state with respect to which a child may have been conceived. And living in a marital relationship within this state, notwithstanding subsequent departure from this state, as to all proceedings authorized by the statute, so long as the petitioning party has continued to reside in this state or has continued to be a member of the armed forces stationed in this state. So that is the reach of the Washington long-arm statute, and somebody has to find a tether to jurisdiction within that statute. The statute by itself doesn't make the law. You have interpretations of that statute. And let's look at one of those now. We have a situation where an individual is employed by a company and is doing a job that involves sales, and they earn some sales commissions. And then, I guess, suddenly in the dead of night, they decide that they want to close up shop. So they close the company, and as a result, the salesperson is not paid their commissions. So they want their commissions, and Washington State has a statute that says, hey, if your employer stiffs you on commissions, you can get them. She sues under the statute, and the next thing that happens is the sheriff can't serve the company because the company is defunct. It no longer has a business presence in the state. So she sues the former CEO of the company, actually the person who hired her in that situation. And she wants to collect her commissions from him. So the trial court evaluates the personal jurisdiction claim and says, no, we have personal jurisdiction over you. This is one of those situations where, I'm sorry, but you did business here, you employed people here, and the claim arises out of it, and you're on the hook. Well, the CEO didn't like that, so he appealed. And when he appealed, the Court of Appeals told him, you're right, and the trial court was wrong. And so they reversed the trial court's judgment. It then went up to the state Supreme Court, and the state Supreme Court said, hold on a minute there, Haas, that isn't the way this is going to work. The Supreme Court said an out-of-state employer that employs a Washington resident and through that employee conducts business from Washington for over 2 years forms a sufficient connection to the state such that it should reasonably anticipate defending a wage dispute here. Therefore, hiring a Washington resident to perform work in the state constitutes the transaction of business within the state under the long-arm statute. This tie to Washington is especially strong where the personal defendant hired, promoted, paid, and fired the plaintiff. Now, it's important to remember that at the time that he was defending the lawsuit, the CEO was in Pennsylvania, so he was quite a distance away. But at any rate, he wound up having to pay the commissions simply because he basically had a long distance to try and defend that lawsuit from. And of course, that's one of the reasons why there are so many requirements in personal jurisdiction to make sure that you have sufficient minimum contacts and that it's fair to hold you accountable in the foreign state. So let's talk about what happens and what you can do when someone exercises personal jurisdiction against you and you don't believe that they have that jurisdiction or that the exercise of that jurisdiction is compatible with due process. What do you do? The very first thing you should do is hire a good lawyer to defend you. And the reason I say that is because, particularly with regard to personal jurisdiction, it is possible to waive personal jurisdiction. And depending on the state law of the jurisdiction where the court sits, there could be all kinds of procedural traps that you may know nothing about going into this particular type of scenario. In some states, you have to do what's called a special appearance, because if you have a general appearance, if you just show up and file a motion to dismiss, then you have consented to the jurisdiction of the court. And you don't want to do that, so you have to file a special appearance and a motion to dismiss. And it is possible to file a motion to dismiss for lack of personal jurisdiction, and if you're successful, the case goes away. Several years ago, I had a case in Texas where my client was being charged for airplane parts that he never bought, that somebody who had leased the aircraft from him had bought when they were down there, and they had the obligation to get a part replaced and fixed because they were leasing the aircraft, and they didn't pay for it. So instead of suing the ne'er-do-well who defaulted on his lease, we had to repossess his airplane from him so that we could get back to getting money for having leased that aircraft. And as a result, we had the aircraft in our possession, and they brought a suit against us for the value of the parts that were on the aircraft that, again, we hadn't authorized. So The real question was whether we had sufficient minimum contacts with that state in order to justify personal jurisdiction. And as it turned out, we did not. And the case was dismissed. They came to Missouri then and filed the case against my client in Missouri. And eventually we worked out an agreement with them where we could sort of share the losses involved with that particular person who leased the aircraft. But these are the kinds of things that happen, and those are the kinds of issues that come up in personal jurisdiction. Now, in that case, personal jurisdiction case in Texas, it had been filed in federal court. If it had been filed in state court, it might have come out different. But let's say that for whatever reason, the trial court does not grant your motion to dismiss for personal jurisdiction, for lack of personal jurisdiction. What do you do then? Well, in most states, there is a mechanism to challenge that finding through what's called a writ of prohibition. And the writ of prohibition is an ancient writ. It's been around for centuries. And basically what it says is the court has exceeded its jurisdiction in this regard. If a court exceeds its jurisdiction, a superior court can confine it to its jurisdiction. So a superior court can come in and say, no, you got this wrong, and we are ordering you to dismiss the case. Now, that's not the only way to address it, but that is often the most efficient way. But appellate courts grant writs exceptionally rarely. In fact, they're called extraordinary writs. And so it has to be an extraordinary circumstance before they grant the writ. Where you're dealing with personal jurisdiction, because if the court does not have jurisdiction, no judgment will bind the defendant, it is to both parties' advantage to get an appellate reading on that, because usually the appellate court that will ultimately decide the case on after it's been tried would be the same court that would hear the jurisdictional argument in the writ case. So if for whatever reason the appellate court decides not to grant a writ, that doesn't mean jurisdiction is proper. What it means is you go through the trial process, you get whatever result you get, you still have the right to appeal. And you can say, we fought this all the way, we raised this issue, we now raise this issue on appeal. And if the court agrees with you, you're out. The judgment goes away. If the court does not agree with you, then you can take it up to the state Supreme Court. And because it's a matter of due process, you can take it to the United States Supreme Court if the state Supreme Court doesn't agree with you. Those are pretty much your remedies in terms of appellate work, but there is one more thing you can try in that situation, and that is you can ask the court to dismiss on the basis of forum nonconvenience. Now, I've done a video on this earlier, but forum nonconvenience basically says, look, it is very inconvenient for me to try this case in this venue, and I want to try it. I want you to dismiss this because there's another court in, my home state, Pennsylvania, Michigan, whatever. There's another court in my home state where this case could be brought. And sometimes if it really is particularly oppressive, then there is a chance that you can get a motion to dismiss for forum nonconvenience heard. But those are pretty much your options in terms of dealing with personal jurisdiction. So hopefully this has been helpful to the person who asked the question, and hopefully it has been useful to anybody who didn't understand how personal jurisdiction worked. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments down below. Like, share, subscribe, all that stuff we ask you to do. And as always, if you have the opportunity today to go out of your way and do something nice for someone, please take advantage of that. We can all make the world better, one person at a time, by just going out of our way and doing something nice for people. With that, I'll leave you to it and have a great day. Come catch me down at the beach next time.
If you like this video, here are a few others you might try, and don't forget to subscribe. Have a terrific day, guys.